Please stand by while we wait for others to join. Thank you. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Today is September 29, 2020. Today is a Tuesday, it's not a Wednesday, our usual date. We have the pleasure to be back again with our 6th UTDT Global Tax Talk. My name is Leandro Passarella. I'm a professor of income tax at the University Torquato Di Tella's Masters of Tax Law program. I'm with Professor Celina Valls. Hello, Celina.
Hello, Leandro. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the UTDT Global Tax Talks. We are happy to be back to our 6th dialogue of UTDT Global Tax Talks. Leandro, could you please remind which is the purpose of these talks?
Yes, definitely. As I have been saying, following UTDT's mottos of academic excellence, pluralism, and equal opportunity, UTDT Global Tax Talks is a platform fostering an interdisciplinary dialogue among scholars and faculty members from all continents on a single hard tax topic. Based on a common questionnaire, tax law professors, economists, and political scientists will share their views on the same issues, offering the audience a comprehensive analysis. In its first edition, UTDT Global Tax Talks is covering the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the international tax system. We have a roster of 10 recognized scholars. We have already held dialogues with 5 of them. Today, it is the turn of Africa. We are very pleased to have Professor Jennifer Roeleveld from South Africa.
Jennifer is a professor in the Faculty of Commerce and director of the Tax Unit for Fiscal Research at the University of Cape Town. She is also a visiting professor at Vienna University. She has published extensively, both locally and internationally, in books and journals. She is contributing author of Student Income Tax, Bloomer B&A, and the Global Tax Treaty Commentaries publication of IBFD. She is the president of the International Fiscal Association South Africa and member of the Permanent Scientific Committee of the International Fiscal Association. Professor Jennifer, welcome to the UTDT Global Tax Talks.
Thank you. Thank you very much for including me in the global UTDT tax talks. I must say your previous speakers have been most impressive, and I feel a little bit inferior, but they've already given global views on this topic, this area of discussion. So I will be coming from a South African perspective, and I would think it would be reflective of African countries and the African continent as a whole. Last week, Martin Heersen from the UK gave an excellent overview of the difficulties faced by developing countries, and we agree with those. And this is all partly due to the agendas of governments and authoritative bodies such as the OECD, the UN. They are all in play. And I must add, the influence of the United States cannot be ignored in this mix. And so all of this is in play, and it forms the backdrop of the situation in developing countries that we find ourselves. So having said that, I will address the questions that are going to be posed in turn. Please note that there will be some overlap in some questions because as you know, with taxation, there's nothing that you can look at in isolation. One thing will affect another, so there will be some overlap. And having said that, we can go to our first slide.
Perfect.
Before we first question, sorry.
Yes, no problem. That's fine. Before we go to the slides, just let me give a brief introduction, what we are living right now. Since December of last year, a minuscule life form, a coronavirus, appeared on our human world. Since then, it has silently spread using human beings and their advances in technology as means of transportation. Nowadays, coronavirus is an uninvited guest in our lives and is everywhere. And human beings cannot see it or detect it before its unsettling presence. Once it has already infected human beings, jeopardizing their lives. Governments initially reacted to the virus spread, requesting us or directly requiring us to retreat to our homes, disrupting our normal lives. Borders were closed, planes were grounded. We cannot move far from our places of residence, and if we do, in many cases, we are required to comply with a preventive quarantine. We are very much like in a science fiction book. I'm sorry for that. Until an effective vaccine is designed to allow us to get back to normal, or the pandemic fades away naturally, human beings will continue to be pushed to transform our lifestyles. This transformation includes the way in which we do business. Social distancing is now the rule, and electronic commerce is widespread. Everything is delivered to our doors or screens, and this behavior will likely remain once we learn to coexist with the pandemic. If we change the way we do business, this for sure has tax implications. So far, governments have used tactics and tools already known to them to deal with these pandemic effects on their country's economies, and their long-term results are uncertain. We are going to discuss the challenges that COVID-19 poses to human beings' economic relations and how states could deal with them effectively. We have prepared a questionnaire that all professors and scholars have received in advance. We don't know their answers yet, but we are going to listen to them with very much attention because we are going to provide our conclusions on November 11. Having said that, our first question is the following, Jennifer. The lockdown, as we all know, has not disrupted M&E's activities. Rather, they have adapted rapidly and have continued to operate remotely. During this period, their management may have been located in more than one country. At the same time, some of their activities in other countries may have been performed without the need of any local presence or any significant one. Home office has become the rule, and many employees and independent contractors have got used to it and may be reluctant to go back to their offices. It may no longer be necessary to travel so often again. Also, some M&Es may have decided to reduce their local presence in some jurisdictions. Assuming that the international tax system continues to be based on the source versus residence distinction, should the concept of PE be revisited? How? Sorry. Let me see. How should it be revisited? I'm not, sorry, I'm having a problem here. Cool. So for that purpose, I would like to go to the first question of, I'm sorry. I'm having, Karen found it. This should have not have happened. I'm sorry, Jennifer, for this. So the question again is whether because I wanted to show this picture, this beautiful picture of the University of Cape Town. That's the whole problem, so that the audience could have a view of Cape Town. Let me go back to the question, is whether the concept of PE should be revisited, okay, and how, okay? What is your view on this matter?
All right, first slide. There's a definite shift or a move towards source taxation, or if we want to modernize it, perhaps we should look at the notion of source. If we look at so far weak, outdated domestic legal frameworks to establish the source of income has enabled large M&Es to base erode and shift profits without appropriate levels of source taxation. For example, by the EU and emerging market countries. So this notion of source has up to now been dealt with in terms of legal liability of non-residents, unilateral or bilateral relief in terms of our treaties for double tax, the ability of foreign loss set-offs. And we can see evidence of this by proxies, rules in our legislations, domestic legislations, in case law, which is more prevalent in common law countries where we have judge-made decision-making, and administrative guidelines issued over time, which have become entrenched in our systems. Next slide. These have all evolved and may or may not align with the OECD or the UN model orthodoxies. For example, the adoption of the PE concept, the value creation principles, which we are obsessed with currently, CFC rules, for example, which are gaining more traction and could be seen as an answer to some of the problems. And I have heard it said that the CFC rules, if strengthened and agreed to, could perhaps take the place of the BEPS action plans, which is trying to avoid profit shifting. Now, South Africa has a long history of case law in establishing the source of income, because South Africa was a source country and only became a residence-based country in 2001. And we have to accept that there are tensions between judge-made guidelines and tax treaty law derived from the OECD or the UN or other strong authorities. In the OECD's 2014 original proposal to have a virtual PE, which did not gain traction, maybe this needs to be given more attention. And how should this be structured? Perhaps it should not be called a virtual PE for starters. We need to move away from historical context and thinking. Next slide. The pandemic has highlighted how MNEs have had to adapt, and Leandro has mentioned that in his opening. And really, MNEs moving away from physical presence, so the PE itself is not the correct or the appropriate description. And I think that we have to start moving away from calling it even a virtual PE, because in many African countries, for example, most business is done via mobile phones. Can you even talk about a PE in this context. It maybe has to be called something else, and that will help us get our heads around changing this into something else. For example, the extractive industries, oil and gas, mining, these are not such a problem as there is always a place of mining or whatever, which can be identified. Also, special economic zones are more easily to identify. However, having said that, this doesn't mean to say that these historical PEs have been actually taxed fairly, and whether they have the taxing rights that they should be having. And we'll deal with that a little bit more later. So I think to answer the question, I think we have to be careful of qualifying different or applying different rules to certain industries. And for example, a popular and renowned South African hotel during the COVID period and the pandemic, as they were not allowed to have any hotel guests, they resorted to becoming a kind of laundry, because they had facilities for doing laundry, and this is what they did during the lockdown. So diversification has appeared all over, and the pandemic has given rise to this, but I think our digital economy, in any event, has these kinds of problems associated with it, diversification. Another example I can give you of a florist organization which delivers flowers on birthdays, etc. This couldn't happen either. So what they did is they resorted to delivering essential goods, which was permitted during the pandemic in South Africa. So I would say whatever direction we take, it has to be robust. It has to be robust enough for many years into the future to be able to deal with upturns and downturns and take that into account. If we look at the treaties and the models that we've had in the past, they really did stand the test of time and have been there since the first treaty was signed between Saxony and Prussia. The thing is, it's been there so long, now is perhaps the time to change. And I think change is inevitable. Perhaps we're not yet close enough to the solutions for this. So that is my answer to question 1.
Thank you, Professor. The next question is related with the previous one, and it's read as follows. Is there a current international tax system designed to attribute tax jurisdiction among states fairly, so they can generate tax revenue to deal with situations like the COVID-19 pandemic effectively? Why? If this goal is not achieved with the current system, how could it be attained? Which line of policy should be followed to achieve this goal?
All right, next slide. Well, my initial reaction to this question is maybe it is okay for some, but definitely not for all. Bilateral treaties depend on negotiating skills of participating states, and South African treaties and African treaties are usually of the OECD type and have been found to be not fit for purpose to ensure that revenues are taxed in the source country, especially in mineral-rich countries. A study was done across Africa, various countries with various kinds of resources, and to look at whether the PE concept, as we know it today, protected their taxing rights over their resources. And the answer was actually generally no. So what happened is that at the negotiating table, there were perhaps stronger developed countries involved, and there is always compromise, as we know, and maybe they didn't get the result that they should have, but were prepared to compromise because they wanted to have the treaty in place. Some African countries have actually been imposing withholdings taxes, which are not in line with the treaties that they have. But if you think about it, that's not such a bad idea. It is better to extract some tax from the large MNEs at the time that it is extracted from that country than wait to sort it out later. So I have a sympathy with that situation. Of course, those countries could terminate the treaty, but it might not be in the interest of the country to be, or the governments to actually do that. Next slide. South Africa was in an economic decline before the pandemic, and this decline has been increased substantially, particularly because of the overly strict lockdown rules in South Africa, and has certainly exacerbated the situation. South Africa is not in a good economic situation right now, and I think this can be reflected in many other countries in Africa, although I think they did not have as strict rules as we had in our country. Now, because of the strict lockdown rules, there's been considerable losses in businesses, closing of many businesses, levels of debt have increased tremendously, and unemployment has increased. And there was kind of an assistance in that, please continue to pay your employees, and there will be relief offered for cases like that. But that's not a sustainable situation. And many people now are out of work, and the employment rate has increased tremendously. Now, all of these things lead to a loss of tax revenue. And this is, of course, quite frightening for the revenue authorities, and something always has to be done about this. We have seen an increase in the digital services, and in the form of online shopping. It's becoming the norm to do online shopping, working from home, as was mentioned earlier. And we're in this situation, and we will see more losses in tax revenue if something is not done about it. Next slide. So how do we deal with this situation? And I would say what is missing in the current system, in this new fourth industrial revolution, is the new world of digitalization. And while the OECD has been working on trying to sort out the taxing rights in the world and how to deal with profit shifting particularly, if we look at the BEPS 2 project, it doesn't include digital services tax at all. It has the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, and I'm not going to go into those because I'm sure you all have had quite a lot of information on that. Now, for these to work, you need multinational consensus. And I would say this is very doubtful, particularly this year in 2020, for example. And I do not think that the United States would agree to Pillar 1, certainly not in an election year. Even in the future, I'm not sure that they will come to the party. Pillar 2 is possible. It's basically a modified version of the GILTI and the BEAT in the US. So the US could agree on Pillar 2. And I also have heard from eminent professors and other authors that the view is that the BEPS 2 and Pillar 1 and 2 will probably not lead to much additional revenue, but probably will contribute largely to complexity of administration. I mean, the formulas and the way that it has to be calculated, the way that it has to be used in conjunction with the arm's length principle, you can see it just has increased the complexity. So even although one of the OECD goals is to always search for simplicity, I don't see and I can't see that they're getting anywhere close to being having a simple solution. According to the leaked OECD documents recently, many countries have submitted objections and calls for changes. And I think, next slide, please, is that I think that maybe that the Pillar 1, Pillar 2 is not the answer, and maybe we have to reconsider and move to more of a source basis. I would say digital taxes have to be considered, and maybe we could look at transactional type taxes, taxes on financial services. What about taxes on crypto asset transactions? I would say digital services tax is probably preferable. It has also been mooted that there could be excess profits taxes, like some countries have already introduced. Now, I would say that suits the United States, as that is where the big tech companies reside, but it doesn't suit the market countries, which are the developing countries. And I would say that we have still a long way to go. And in the words of Philip Baker, we need a new group of 5 economists to help us solve this problem and take us forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Very interesting answer, very interesting view from an African perspective. Now, let's make the third question, which is whether the pandemic is an opportunity to shift the current international tax system to set aside the source and residence concept. I think that you have gone already over a little bit on this, but then which should the substitutes be and why? What is the role here of a digital services tax?
I think that the pandemic is a wonderful opportunity to set aside source and residence concepts and re-look at this, because it could give certain authorities the excuse they need to divert to something different. I think it is very difficult for us to get our heads around throwing out what we have historically developed and refined, and it's difficult to change. But maybe this pandemic has given that opportunity to have an excuse for actually going on a different path. And maybe we should have a totally different type of tax. And I think that is an issue which is very difficult for us to get our heads around. If we look at the VAT system of taxing transactions, it seems to be quite successful. And it is working rather well. And especially in South Africa, it's a broader based tax. It has also been very proactive and in taxing cross-border digital services where the normal tax system has failed. I would think that maybe there needs to be better coordination between indirect taxes and source. And this could lead to the possibility of ensuring adequate taxation in source countries. Next slide. As Martin Hessen last week suggested, he said, what about source being replaced by the concepts of origin and destination? Now, I would say the difficulty here would be defining these terms and reaching a consensus on originating cause. For example, as I said right in the beginning, this notion of source, this nexus, are new types of phrases which we need to relook at or look at anew. And I'd like to quote from Judge Watermeyer. This is a very old case that came from the time when South Africa was on a source basis. And so there's a lot of cases on the concept of source. And in this quote, he says that the source of receipts received as income is not the quarter whence they come, but the originating cause of their being received as income. And at this originating cause is the work which the taxpayer does to earn them, the quid pro quo which he gives in return for which he receives them. Now, if you read that, it does conceptualize a lot of the situations we find ourselves in now. And I must just say that the dissenting judge in this case, Schreiner, who was just as good as Watermeyer was, he said he didn't agree with that, and that the interest paid, the case was about interest being received in South Africa, but it originated with the groupings and companies in the Netherlands. And Schreiner said that the interest paid found its source in the indebtedness, which had been assumed by the South African company. And as the company was now resident in South Africa, the source of the income was derived by the company in South Africa. Now, this route dissenting judgment was never followed. And time and time again in case law, you will have Judge Schreiner coming in with the dissenting judgment. And I would say you need to look at both of these judgments to look at our modern day situation and see whether there's something in there, either of them, which we could be using. Next slide. So what this case led to, and we had this test for many, many years in South Africa and probably still do, is looking at the originating cause and then locating that originating cause. So it's not an easy thing to do, but it was a method of actually trying to get to the bottom of where the source of the income was. Now, Martin Heersen suggests also, now if we're looking at residence, maybe residence can be replaced by capital ownership or intellectual property ownership. Now, I would say that this is always very difficult because of the inability to establish beneficial ownership. For example, the use of trusts, the use of corporates in between the owner and the source of the income. So I would say this would not improve the situation, and maybe the country by country reporting goes some way to looking at or establishing beneficial ownership. But I don't think this solves any of the problems that we are facing now. So I would say the debate needs to continue.
Thank you, Professor. Now we are in a position to move to the transfer pricing questions. The pandemic affects the multinationals' intercompany transactions comparability. Which are the challenges and possible solutions to determine the arm's length range during this economic downturn?
I would say basically comparability has always been a problem in African countries. And now the pandemic has highlighted or caused more difficulties. For example, low profit margins. For example, an MNE operating in opening a store chain in a country for the first time. What are the comparables? There aren't really legitimate comparables, certainly not using comparables from Europe European companies or from companies in the EU. And so what comparables can you or should you be using? And will administrations take this into account, especially after the pandemic now, where this is going to become an even bigger problem? The implementation of BEPS Action 4, which is limitation on interest deductions, we know that debt restructuring has become a particular problem. It has so in South Africa, and I'm sure it has globally. And during the pandemic and afterwards, no relief has been offered or consideration after the pandemic. All that was offered in South Africa was a delay of the implementation of limiting interest deductions for a short while. And I think debt will remain a serious issue even after the pandemic. Then another problem is the practicality of the arm's length principle for some of the reasons that I've already mentioned. And having no safe harbor rules, I would say this creates quite a bit of uncertainty. The worry is, will tax administrations take this into account? And the fact that they're going to be seeking tax revenue, increased revenue, I hardly think that this is something they're going to be too mindful about. Next slide, please. All right, so as I said, these issues have been already in existence before the pandemic, and there should be safe harbor rules. In Brazil, they have safe harbor rules, which we heard about quite recently, and they say it seems to be working quite well. I also think it brings certainty for taxpayers where there are safe harbor rules. South Africa used to have safe harbor rules for thin capitalization, and they used to have a 3-to-1 of debt to equity ratio, and it was more comfortable to have that in place. It was then removed, and now there is just uncertainty because you have to rely on the tax authorities to agree with your methods, and the documentation that is required is really quite onerous. So we need to simplify the transfer pricing rules, and comparable searches, for example, shouldn't be case by case. It just is too onerous in a developing country who do not have the capacities that you see in developed countries, and they spend many hours working on doing a case-by-case calculations, and I think it could be done in a different way. Significant economic presence should be in play, I would suggest, and definitely thresholds for country-by-country reporting should reflect the realities of developing countries. I mean, there is a lot of work that has to be done and reporting to actually determine if reporting is actually necessary. And this is where the thresholds could be helpful to eliminate a lot of that extra work which produces no result. For example, in the country-by-country reporting or reports that have to be submitted. And the G24 proposals on inclusive framework on BEPS did state that simple formulaic methods to allocate profits fairly between countries should be based on real activities in each country. Now, this wasn't followed, but it was something that was stated. So I find that very often statements are made, and maybe that is to appease developing countries, but no, it's not seen in the outcomes that in the OECD reports that come out. And if I could just end this part, is that the unified approach in Pillar 1, the B in the formula, is certainly not suitable for developing countries. South Africa has already produced a report on what it should be, or why it isn't suitable for developing countries. So I still see that there's a lot of work still to be done before Pillar 1 is going to come to fruition. Okay.
Thank you, Jennifer. So do you think that then that formulary apportionment that proposed Professor Avillona may not be good for developing countries? Is that correct? Did I get it right?
Yeah, I think it is correct. I think it has to be something slightly different. I think Brazil has some good thoughts on how it should go, but I'm not seeing any movement in that direction.
Okay, that's great. So now let's move from companies to individuals. Many countries or many governments have the idea of creating or imposing a new or an additional wealth tax on their residents or perhaps their non-residents as well. What are your views? Do you think that they are going to be good for these countries, or they are going to increase the economic stress and or probably the poverty?
Okay, next slide. Well, are wealth taxes a solution to our problem? Well, I'm afraid I'm not in favor of wealth taxes, and I've written quite a lot on this, and been misquoted sometimes on my work. And I'll give you some reasons why I'm against a wealth tax. And these are some reasons, and it could be mirrored, I would say, in a lot of African countries maybe who have similar systems to South Africa. South Africa already has capital gains tax. It wasn't always there. And there's capital gains tax on every gift, if you make a donation, if sales of assets. And so all of those attract capital gains tax. Now, if we look at immovable property sales in South Africa, the capital gain that is calculated is very often a gain that is due to inflation. Your house that you sell, your house hasn't changed, it's the same house, and yet you're making an enormous gain due to inflation, and you're paying a tax on those capital gains. We do not have indexing in South Africa like Australia has, and that's why I say that is one of the issues. There's also estate duty or inheritance tax and capital gains tax on death. So there's already two taxes on death. There are no deferrals. So even though there's no cash that changes hands, so you do not have the cash to pay the tax because there's no sale, it's been transferred to heirs or beneficiaries, there are these two taxes. It is a known fact that estate duty inheritance taxes brings in very little revenue to the system. In South Africa, it's 0.12% of tax revenue, so that is very small. The thought was that they did not want to do away with the estate duty because it keeps wealthy persons on a record of where the wealth is, but I don't believe that that is a valid answer, because capital gains tax does the exact same thing. And with exchange of information that we have now, it is not difficult to actually seek out where the wealth is. Also, the number of wealthy people is so small if you consider the whole population. And these wealthy people are extremely mobile, and they will certainly move assets, they'll move themselves offshore if wealth taxes are imposed and become too onerous. In South Africa, there's no social security system. And next slide. And in addition, medical costs, education, retirement benefits are all self-funded. So here we are different to countries in the north, where maybe there's free education and there are certainly retirement benefits. We do not have that in South Africa. So if you can look at that situation as a whole, I would say it would be really extremely detrimental to bring in a wealth tax and chase away the very persons who are the shareholders in multinational companies and are also serving the community in many ways. So what are the other alternatives? And I would say I would agree with Martin Heersen in some respects in when he said existing taxes must be used better. And I would say that is key. And existing wasteful government expenditure should be reduced first, and more taxes can be collected through more efficient administration. We had a commission set up recently to review the tax system in South Africa, and they did quite a bit of research on the benefits for the fiscus if a wealth tax was to be introduced. The outcome was a marginal increase, and it was decided not to go down that path. And after COVID, it might be reconsidered. I hope not, because I really don't think this is the way to go. Certainly other countries may do so, but certainly not for developing countries and certainly not for South Africa. Next slide. We need to eliminate corruption, and I have to be transparent about that. We have enormous corruption in very high places, and we have wealthy taxpayers who are the ultimate payers of corporate tax together with the employees. And these wealthy taxpayers have contributed voluntarily, especially during the pandemic, and their contribution has been towards alleviating poverty, people who really have not been able to feed their families during this COVID period, and also to alleviate pandemic conditions, for example, supplying, seeing that sanitizing equipment and masks could be provided. Now, these wealthy people have already contributed so much to a special fund that was created by the government to actually help in these situations. I don't think it's fair that you then ask these same people who are actually the employers as well in the multinationals of those people that they want to keep in employment. And I think it would be unfair to ask them to contribute further. I think there's a better way of targeting relief. And if one introduces a new tax, it all once again goes into the same pot. And I don't think it reaches the desired target. I would say that maybe it's a reality that developing countries have issues and problems which developing countries don't have. So one size does not fit all. Okay, next question.
Yes, but before that, go into that question, I hope that your dissenting voice becomes the majority.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. That's a very interesting point of view. Now, if the government introduced such a measure, such as the wealth tax, how do you think that the taxpayer would react to such measure?
If we look at basically increasing tax rates instead of, say, introducing wealth tax, which we just spoke about, I think this is very problematic. There was a huge outcry in South Africa when VAT was increased by 1% to 15%. This was in a setting fraught with corruption, and I would say it is very difficult to sell or even substantiate the notion of rate increases in situations like this. Increased debt, for example, compounds the problem where taxes even just cannot be paid. The corporate tax rate is already high at 28%. So I would say that this is a very sensitive area, and the unions, the opposing parties in government all were really up in arms about the increase in the VAT rate. And the thing that happened is that subsequent to the increase, it was found that there was corruption at the Revenue Authority. And if that monies that were due to the Revenue Authority had legally come in as they should have, they would not have had to increase the VAT rate. So this is in the public domain, and it is quite, it does worry the citizens. And the thing is, we know that once things go up, they don't bring them down. And I would say administration and capacity must be improved to collect the taxes that are actually due first. If there's anti-avoidance, the GAR rules should be applied. We have hardly applied them in South Africa. And this should be done before thinking about increasing rates or introducing any new taxes. Just to note that the carbon tax kicks in South Africa very soon. It has been in the making for some years. It was delayed slightly because of the COVID, but it has already become effective. Now, this may go a little way to alleviate the revenue deficit and, of course, to clean up the environment. So I must say that corruption must be eliminated. And I think maybe the opposite is true. Rather reduce the corporate tax rate by 3% and strategize better. Make use of SEZs, special economic zones, much better. Improve the small business opportunities. And the pandemic has resulted in many smaller operations coming into play because as a solution for other lost revenue. We need to grow our economy, reduce unproductive government expenditure, and as I said before, improve tax collection. Just as an aside is that during our lockdown is that alcohol and tobacco was prohibited from selling those items. So what happened is the illicit trade increased tremendously. Now, we have levies which have been increasing each year on alcohol and tobacco. Now, those levies were not collected. So enormous loss of revenue, which maybe was unnecessary because of the strict rules. But what it did do is the illicit trade has increased. And when you have illicit trades, no tax is collected at all. So I think there's some things that need to be fixed and things that have really been very bad for the economy. Okay. We can go to question 7.
Exactly, our final question. So the question is whether tax policy makers should be thinking out of the box to alleviate their country's problems, okay, to help the vulnerable, to find new collaborative solutions rather than the usual tax increases and money printing techniques. And whether poorer countries have a claim to receive tax revenues from richer countries to help them to cope with crises like COVID-19, and whether there should be some type of interconnection for that. What are your views, Jennifer?
Next slide.
Yes.
I would say I do not think that there is any claim to receive tax revenues from richer countries beyond what has been legitimately negotiated. And I have to ask, is this really a tax problem? If we look, I'm not certain that this problem can be solved with tax. If we look at the OECD, and Pillar 1, I don't think it's as seriously taken developing countries into account. And this is becoming evident with Pillar 1. And for example, arguments for inter-nation equity. Can this be balanced against contrasted positions of tax competition, minimum tax proposals? Raising debt, for example, via the IMF or the World Bank. The problem with that is, and South Africa has resisted this for many, many years. With the pandemic, they had to succumb, and they have made use of the IMF borrowings. The problem with this, it compounds the problem for developing countries in that as soon as you receive money from the IMF or the World Bank, in a way you are beholden to these organizations and the policies that they're going to dictate. And those policies would be the same voices that we have been hearing to now. So I would say my answer to this, I don't think this can be solved. The solution isn't tax. Maybe the trade agreements, investment agreements need to be revived again as a solution, especially for getting investment into developing countries, or genuine investment into developing countries, not for self-seeking reasons, but to actually assist the developing countries. So that is my answer for question 7.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Yes, we have a question from our audience. If you agree, we can move to this question.
Okay, I'll try. Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor. Would African countries be willing to submit a formal proposal to the G20 and OECD on how the international tax system should be adapted to the 21st century?
That is an excellent question, and I wish we could do that. So it's not to say we're not trying. And I must just mention that the African Tax Administration Forum, ATAF, has devised its own model treaty, and it has the voice of all the African tax administrators, so 39 countries, which means that it's about 72% of tax administrations in Africa. So this could become a very strong voice to ensure that revenue is drawn back to the African continent. It could be an answer. It unfortunately has not had the momentum that they first thought they would have, and I think that is because of the enormity of the capacities in a lot of African countries, where capacities are so low that they do not even have revenue authorities offices. It's really a dire situation. And so they have to be helped by the stronger countries. South Africa has been part of this from the beginning and was one of the instigators of it, and does lend assistance, but it has a way to go still. So I think, yes, it could be a voice. There is also the African Free Trade Agreement, which has recently come into force. This was also put on hold because of the pandemic, but it's now going forward. And this could be the world's biggest free trade area if this comes into play. And negotiations will resume next year. And it deals with customs clear and digital trade. It deals with competition policy, intellectual policy rights, and investment protocols. So here are two areas which could very well, and I wish that that does happen. You have to have the government's permissions or the political wills, and I think, as it was said earlier in some talks, the political situations are sometimes a big hindrance to moving forward on this matter. So, yes, I think it's a possibility.
That's great. We have Parto Shom in the audience, and he would like to ask you a question. I will ask. Parto?
Thank you. I did send the question through the question answer the thing, but I don't know, I didn't go. But my question basically was that the CIT rate in South Africa is 28%, which, as you say, is quite high by international comparison. South Africa, and you then mentioned GAR should be applied more widely, but the GAR law in South Africa is one of the relatively more strict laws. Aren't you concerned in the overall milieu of emerging economies that if applied too widely, it may lead to roving inquiries against companies that are already struggling, as you yourself have mentioned in some of your earlier strides, which I agree with. But the issue about GAR confused me a little bit. So would appreciate an answer. Thank you.
I would say why I said that, because we keep hearing from our revenue authorities and our new commissioner. They're a little bit quiet on this at the moment, but certainly the previous commissioner and that is that they know of defaulters, they know of corporates and multinationals that are actually not paying their rightful taxes. And so we need to now introduce these new rules, these new kinds of reporting, because there are these people that they're not collecting tax from. Now, I always say it is easy to have a general statement and say, well, now we have to increase the rate because we're losing revenue because of situations like it. And I say, no, why not hit the defaulters if you can, have targeted GAR. I mean, CFC rules are already anti-avoidance rules, and we have quite a lot of targeted anti-avoidance regarding interest, hybrid instruments. We have so many targeted anti-avoidance rules which are extremely difficult to comply with. And we've never used our GAR, which is highly sophisticated. Maybe it could be, as you say, maybe it is too general, and it needs to be redesigned so that it fits a developing country or South African situation. Because we borrowed the GAR from legislation from Canada and Australia, and maybe it's not going to be suitable for South Africa. So I take that point.
Thank you. Very good. So I think that we have reached the end of our 6th UTDT Global Tax Talk. Jennifer, thank you very much for your views. It has been very interesting to listen to you and what you have to say. I don't know, Celina, if you have anything to say that you would share with us.
Just to say thank you to Jennifer. Thank you very much.
Well, so we will be closing this talk, and we will be preparing for our next dialogue next week with Professor Suranjali Tandon from India, which will be held next Wednesday. Thank you very much, Jennifer, for making yourself available to speak today on a Tuesday. So we will be seeing each other next Wednesday, October 7 at 1 p.m. GMT again. Until then, take care, stay safe, and wear your masks. Bye-bye.